Please read this lesson on Mary Rowlandson after having read Mary Rowlandson's narrative. The background on Mary Rowlandson provided here comes from the Women's History Archive. The link to this archive can be found on this page. In 1676, near the end of King Philip's War, a group of Indians attacked Lancaster, burned the town, and captured many of the settlers. Mary Rowlandson and her 3 children were among them. Reverend Joseph Rowlandson, her husband, a Puritan preacher, was on his way to Boston at the time to raise troops to protect Lancaster. Sarah, 6, died in captivity of her wounds. She used her skill in sewing and knitting as the Indians moved around in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire to elude capture by the colonists. She met with the Wampanoag chief, Metacom, who had been named King Philip by the settlers. 3 months after capture, Mary Rowlandson was ransomed for 20 pounds. She was returned at Princeton, Massachusetts on May 2, 1676. Her 2 surviving children were released soon after. Their home had been destroyed in the attack, so the Rowlandson family reunited in Boston. She was held captive for 11 weeks. She and her daughter Sarah were wounded in the attack. Her sister and one of her children were killed. Joseph Rowlandson was called to a congregation in Connecticut in 1677. In 1678, he preached a sermon about his wife's captivity, entitled, "A Sermon of the Possibility of God's Forsaking a People That May Have Been Near and Dear to Him." 3 days later, Joseph died suddenly. The sermon was included in early editions of Mary Rowlandson's narrative. The book was originally titled, "The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, Together with the Faithfulness of His Promises Displayed," being a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Miss Mary Rowlandson, commended by her to all that desire to know the Lord's doings to and dealings with her, especially to her dear children and relations. Yes, that's a very long title, but it became a bestseller in both New England and back in England, further reinforcing the religious nature of the conflict with the Native American tribes. The Puritans detested fiction because, again, they considered it lying. So these kinds of stories were the only thrillers they were allowed because they were histories. Note that from the very beginning, Rowlandson's captivity quickly became used as a religious morality tale, meant to reinforce the idea that true faith in God would help one overcome obstacles. 6 years after the incident, her autobiographical story was published with a preface by Increase Mather, the preacher, emphasizing that this was a story reinforcing religious faith. Her husband, on the other hand, had actually found a different moral from the story, yet he died 3 days after telling the story. He thought that this meant that God had forsaken the Puritan people. His death quite soon after telling that particular sermon emphasized that he had lost faith. As written, she believed her story was further evidence that God had placed the Indians on this continent so as to do the devil's work, in order to test the faith of the Puritans. The preachers of this time, including Increase and Cotton Mather, fully pushed this idea in their sermons, which of course only escalated tensions between the groups. At this time, there was a certain kind of heroism in surviving Indian captivity. It was proof that God would help them survive the devil's attempt to overrun them. Note that within the narrative itself, there is reference to praying Indians. These were Indians who had been converted to Christianity, that they were always considered mad and unstable because they were uncomfortably trapped between 2 cultures and occasionally rebelled violently. An example is given in Tom and Peter. One says that they will kill her husband and gets very agitated, but then says they would not harm those who came unarmed. Throughout her entire ordeal, Rowlandson sees God's hand in all of this. When the Indians are able to cross a difficult river, and yet the English troops can't, she believes this is because they were not yet ready or worthy of God's deliverance. She does take note of a few small kindnesses, such as one person giving her a Bible or carrying the baby on the horse, and some relatively humane interactions, paying her for making a shirt, inviting her to dinner with Philip, the chief. While she clearly is captive, this is not the sadistic prisoner of war captivity one might expect. She is paid for sewing. She is given leave at times. She even notes that while walking miles to see her son, she was treated kindly by the Indians she passes on her way. While this ultimately does not change her view of the Indians as savage, it is interesting to note where she seems to recognize some humanity in them. She also notes moments of clear cruelty and poor treatment. She ultimately believes that God has preserved the Indians to punish the Puritans for their sins. Through her narrative, we see evidence of these Native Americans being changed by the settlers' influence. Some converted to Christianity. Some seem particularly upset by Christianity. Note the one woman who throws her Bible out the door. Also, they seem to have taken to Western clothing and the use of bullets, as well as alcohol. King Philip, whose real name was Metacom, gets drunk. This was the beginning of a long thread of alcoholism among Native Americans. Sadly, alcohol was often provided to Native Americans by settlers in order to debilitate them. Rowlandson tries to dispel the idea that the English can get rid of the Indians by just ruining their crops or raiding their village. She suggests that God allows them to persist so as to be a scourge to the Puritans and thus serve his larger purpose.